Now let's take a look at sharing files with Windows. So we talked about access files with NTFS and a little bit about sharing files and permissions. But now let's talk about how we can actually share those files and some of the services and roles available to us. So there are methods to configure folder sharing. You can use simple file sharing. There's advanced sharing dialog box. You can use the shared folder snap-in. And then there's the file and storage services, as well as the share and storage management interfaces. So these are some various ways that you can configure file sharing in Windows Server 2012. Before we go too far here, so we already talked about file permissions, and something that's unique to file sharing is how you can set up deny in a access control entity or access control list for file sharing. So deny permission. So basically what that means is you can apply a deny to a folder. That way it denies access to a folder to a certain resource or a certain object or entity on the network. The deny permission should use cautiously and only for exceptions to the rule. So as a rule, a deny permission overrides an allow permission. So that's normally how it works. So if you both allow and deny, the deny will always override the allow permission in Windows with file sharing. However, there is an exception if the deny permission is inherited from a parent object and the allow permission is explicitly added to an object's DACL, then it's going to allow access to that object. So it's important to understand that deny could get overridden if it's inherited. So if you inherited the deny permission, but then there's an allow assigned to that actual object, it's going to override it. It's important to understand that because you may think that it's going to inherit deny no matter what somebody does lower down that chain, but it may or may not do that. Well, actually, it won't do that, strictly speaking. So it's important to be aware of that. So creating shares with file and storage services. So to create a share and set the number of sharing options in the new share wizard. So in the file and storage server role, there are 5 options for setting the share profile. So when you're sharing, you can use SMB Share Quick, Advanced, or Applications, or you could use NFS Share Quick or Advanced. So these are the options you have. So again, you can use SMB or NFS. We talked a little bit about what SMB versus NFS is. But basically NFS you would use if you're in an environment that's both Linux and or both Unix, Linux, Mac, and Windows, because NFS would be natively compatible with Mac and Linux and so forth. Otherwise, you have to install a bunch of packages for Samba to work. But SMB shares work great in the Windows environment. So SMB works well if it's all in the Windows ecosystem or the Microsoft ecosystem. So you can set the following additional options for SMB share. So if you're setting up SMB, you get more options, which is good. You know, if you're in a Windows environment, it's good to use SMB because we have these other options. You can enable access-based enumeration. What that means is users will only see files that they have access to. So if they don't have access to a file, it doesn't even show it to you. So you don't even know it's there if you don't have access to it. That could have good, there's good things about that and bad things. I guess the good thing is that somebody can't see the files that they could have access to, thus they don't know what they could break into. But I guess the downside is users don't know what they could have access to, right? They don't see those resources that they really ought to have access to, so they won't even know to ask for access to a resource. You can allow caching of a share. What that means is client-side caching. So, so when a user is offline, they could cache files from a file share. You can either allow that or not allow that. Again, it depends on your security posture whether or not you're doing that. You can encrypt data access. So when you turn that on in older versions of Windows, when you use file sharing, even though the file would be encrypted in NTFS at its source, and once it's copied, maybe it could be encrypted at its destination, it wasn't encrypted in transit. In 2012, you can enable that encryption so that it's encrypted while it's in transit, that file. That way if somebody has a packet sniffer or something like that, they won't be able to see the contents of that file while it's being copied. So you have that full end-to-end encryption. Shared folders can be created and managed with the net share command if you're using the PowerShell. There's a couple of commands to do that. There's the net share and then the path to the file. For example, you can use net share and just the share name to list information about that share. Net share delete if you want to remove a share. Net share just shows all the shares that you have available on that particular server. So here's an example of some of those commands that you can use in the PowerShell to manage your shared files. And this would, of course, be useful if you're doing this from Core Edition, right? So if you're using Core or Minimal Edition of Windows, these might be good tools. Although you could still use the user interface to do this from a different server, which we've talked about previously. So administrative shares basically are hidden shares that are created by default when you turn on file sharing. So when you enable file sharing, there'll be three by default. There's the admin share, drive, and IPC. So admin is basically if you put in two backslashes and then the server name, then backslash um, some Windows folder name, and this would be in the Windows directory like system32 $, you would be able to access files in system32 directly. And that's created by default. And of course, the permissions are the local administrator for that server by default. Although if it's in the domain, anybody with the domain administrator credentials could also access it. The drive $ administrative share basically is if you're an administrator, you can go to / server name /C $, for example, and you'll see everything in the C drive. You can put D $ and see everything in the D drive. So it allows you to bypass the, whether files are shared or not, you'll be able to access them with the drive letter $ at the end of the UNC path. And then IPC $ is inter-process communications, and that's used for basically for communication over the network with Windows components, essentially. So the domain controller is going to have those three, plus a few additional ones. It's going to have the net logon, which is used for storing default user profiles, and it will also have the sysvol share, which is used by Active Directory for replication. So you can also manage shares using the shared folders snap-in to create, delete, and monitor shares. You can view open. You can monitor and manage user connections or sessions. So the shared folder snap-in has the following subnodes. You've got the shares subnodes, which allows you to show all of your shares and what their path is. So it's a good place to manage all these shares. But again, you could also use the commandlets from PowerShell to see all that stuff too. Sessions shows you any active sessions that are using these shares. And open files lists all the files that network users currently have open. So it's got some nice tools in this. Excuse me. There's some nice tools in the shared folder snap-in that helps you manage file sharing. So for shared resources to be useful, users have to know how to access them. There's a variety of ways that users can access these various file shares. So here are some common methods. One is the UNC path. So an example of a UNC path, if I had a server called Bob, and on that server I had a share called, I don't know, documents, then in my, I would click start and then run, and I would type //. The backslash, by the way, is the one above the enter key. Bob, which is the name of the server, / documents, which is the name of the share. And then it might ask me to log in if it has, if every one read is not enabled, then I'll have to log in for it to check my permissions, and I'll see the files. So that's the kind of the most straightforward way to access it, is through the UNC path, which is just a path that you could enter on any device to try to get to that share. You could also use Active Directory search to find a file share. So you could use search within Active Directory. Another way is to map the drive. So if you go into, you can map a share. So if you go into Windows and you go to drive mapping, you right click and say map a drive letter. That Bob / documents, I could map a drive letter called F, for example, or X or whatever. And then I would have access to that share through that map drive letter. And I could also hit that little box that makes it persistent, so every time the user logs in, they'll be able to see that new map drive. Another method is to just simply browse the network. You've probably seen this in Windows, where if you click on that little network tab, I think very few people actually ever use this, but you can click on that and it will show you all the shares on your network. One of the reasons it's kind of hard to use that is on a large network, you can see a lot of stuff in there, and it takes a long time to scroll through all that if you're on a huge network. On smaller networks, though, it works just fine, so you can go through that to find the share. So, for example, if there was a share on W2K12R2-test2, I could click on that, and then I would see all the shares on that system, and then I could click through until I get to the files that I'm looking for. So again, those are the four options. We can use the UNC path, Active Directory search, map the drive letter, or just browse the network. If we're going to use UNC or mapping a drive, we do have to know the path to that file. We have to know what server it's on, as well as the share name. With Active Directory search, it's a little bit easier, and it's really designed for larger enterprise networks. Or you could just browse the network, which is designed for smaller networks, but you don't really have to know what you're looking for. You can just browse. through just like you would on your own computer through your own file system. So when you're working with SMB or with file sharing, you can also set quotas. Quotas are important because if you're giving everyone access to write files, you might have a single user that uses a little bit too much, right? They're storing all of their files in the share. So you can use quotas to prevent that from happening. So quotas are configured in the quota tab in the NTFS volumes properties dialog box. You got some options for quotas. You can enable quota management. So you have to check that if you're going to use quotas on that volume. You can deny disk space to users that exceed their quota limit. So you can set the limit and then users cannot exceed that limit. You can enable quota management, which you have to check in order to apply that, which we talked about at the volume level. So you have to do it not only at the volume level, but at the share level. Deny disk space to users that exceed their limit. You can not limit disk usage, right? You just track what the users are storing. Limit disk space to a certain amount. So you type in the amount that you want to limit it to. You can log an event when the user exceeds their limit, and you can log when they've exceeded their warning level. So it can do a warning when they reach a certain level, and it can send and it can deny access once they reach the actual limit for the quota. So quota entries, when you click on that, opens the quota entries window, which is in the next slide here, which I'm going to show you here in just a second. So this is what you'll see when you click on the quota limits. Shadow copying basically allows you to store multiple versions of a file with file sharing. So when you're using Windows Server as a file server, some users will want to see a history of their files. Obviously, if you're going to store this history of files so people can see older versions of their files, it's going to use a lot more storage space because the operating system, the file server now has to store multiple versions of everyone's files. So that certainly could be a concern. So Windows will allocate space in the same volume automatically where shadow copies are enabled. So if you enable this, the shadow copies by default are going to be on that same volume, but you could move it to a different volume. So you can have a different volume just for the shadow copies. So you can use the settings dialog box to change the location, which is going to look like this. So you can change where that shadow volume is going to be. So when the disk space allocated for shadow copies reaches the specified limit, older shadow copies are deleted, and the maximum number of previous versions that are kept is 64, which is an awful lot. Shadow copies use the Volume Shadow Copy Service, or VSS. So that was introduced in Windows 2003, and of course it was available in 2008 and now 2012. And it enables the shadow copies and allows copying files that are open, which allows making backups of files and applications without taking them offline. In the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about work folders.